Welcome you all to the Holland Land Office Museum for our guest speaker series. Thank you for braving the wet weather today. We're very excited to continue the guest speaker series. It's now in our 9th full year of going strong, so we've been having about 24 speakers every year through this program, so we're very excited about that. And this year, we want to thank Tompkins Community Bank and the Batavia Rotary Club for their assistance in this program, as well as GoArt for a grant through the Regrant Program. So I will read this short little statement. I would like to acknowledge GoArt's support of this project. GoArt recognizes that this gathering takes place on the ancestral lands of the Seneca Nation, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and acknowledges their enduring presence in this region. So thank you again to GoArt for their support of the guest speaker and concert series for this year. Tonight we're very happy to welcome Richard Chamberlin, who he stopped in many times already this year for me, but now he actually gets to talk. So, but he is going to share the pretty interesting story of a second great uncle.
Yes.
See, I had to think about that. John Newton Chamberlin, who served in the Civil War, and he is decked out for us tonight. But he will share his story.
Thank you very much. Does everybody can hear me okay? Is this
Yes.
too loud? Okay. I thank you very much for having me here. I thank Ryan for having me. I thank my friend from high school that came up to see me, Rick Murphy, and I want to thank my wife for all her support through these various projects that I do. A little bit about me. John Newton was my second great uncle. I've had a lifelong interest in the Civil War. I've been in numerous battlefields with my wife over the course of the years. Just a couple years ago, we were down at Gettysburg and Antietam for probably about the third time. I have an interest in family history. I played around with Family Tree Maker and Ancestry quite a bit, and I always knew about John Newton. A little bit more about me was I retired as the rank of captain from the Chicago Police Department. I worked there 36 years, and then after there I went to work for the Erie County Police Academy, and I worked there 9 years. Most of it was part-time, some of it was full-time, and what I did was I ran a supervision school, and I also worked with the Basic Academy. As I said, I always knew about John Newton from doing the family history stuff. I knew he was buried down in Weesport, New York. I knew he was buried there with his brothers and his sisters. I knew he was a captain of a United States Colored Troops unit, and I knew he was involved in something called the Red River Campaign, but I never knew really much about him. And then one day, what it was, I was on Amazon looking for a book to read on the Civil War, and lo and behold, I come across this book, and I look at it and I think, oh my gosh, that's my relative, that's his second great uncle. So I get a copy of the book, I read it, I get a hold of the author. The author was his great-grandson. He's a retired college professor out in Fort Collins, Colorado. He gave me quite a bit of information. He put me in contact with a reenactor that was out in California that helped me out. He also told me about a newspaper article that was written about him in a local paper out there, and I have copies of that newspaper article out here if you want to take a look at it afterwards. And then he told me that his uniform was out in a museum out in Blair, Nebraska. So I got a hold of them, and they sent me some pictures. This uniform that I have, that's a pretty close copy of his uniform. The reenactor told me that the shoulder boards were exact, you know. There's a picture of him that was taken in Elbridge, New York. That was taken in 1870. That's with his wife, Anna Bullock, and his daughter, Marion. A little bit more about him. He was born in Vermont in 1837. His parents were Joel and Polly Metcalf Chamberlin. They moved here. Where they moved was to Seneca, New York. He had 2 brothers. He had 2 sisters. He was a farm boy. He was not high-born. And that's one of the interesting things about him was that he understood a lot of the big picture issues of the war, but he certainly, you know, did not go to West Point or any place like that. He did not come from money. He became a teacher. Probably he was a math teacher. He enlisted in September of 1861 in the 75th New York Volunteers and received his training up in Auburn, New York. A little bit about him as we go through this. He was very religious and he was a devout Christian. He also kept an extensive diary, and he wrote a lot of letters back and forth to his family and other friends. And those letters were all kept by his wife and recorded. And as I said before, he understood a lot of the big picture issues of the war, even though he certainly was not highborn. He was just a farm boy. Now this is the area that he came from, is this Cuba County, Haudenosaunee County area. If we zoom in a little bit farther on this, he was in Seneca, New York. I'm not exactly sure where, but he had a farm down there, and then his brothers and sisters lived up on what became known as Chamberlin Road because it was all occupied by Chamberlains, okay, at that particular time. And it goes over the course of Cuba County and Haudenosaunee County. That's where my father was born, my great-grandfather was born, my grandfather was born. I had a lot of aunts and uncles up there. I spent a lot of time up there when I was a kid growing up, you know. And that's where he moved when he came back from the war. He moved to a house up there. Now, when I say he was very religious, all my research shows that he attended and was a member of the Senate Federated Church. And the Senate Federated Church is a combination of Baptist and Congregationalist. And congregation is a little bit of that Reformed Calvinist movement. And both of those congregations were committed to the abolition movement and to the Underground Railroad, and they defied the fugitive slave law. And it's still a farming community even today, and in August they still have Tractor Sunday where all the farmers drive their tractors to church. There's a picture of the Senate Federated Church as I attended it. Like I say, we were not members, but we went to various family functions there. Now, you had a handout there that you could take a look at from time to time. Some of the big picture stuff that was going on in the war was at the start of the war, the general that was in charge of the Union armies, he was General Winfield Scott. He was pretty old at the time, but he was also a pretty competent guy. And he was a hero pretty much of the Mexican War. And what he said was, if you're going to defeat the South, it's not going to be any easy task. That what you're going to have to do, and he called it the Anaconda Plan, was, what he said was that you're going to have to blockade all of the southern ports with a naval blockade. And the other thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to take control of the Ohio River and also the Mississippi River and divide the South in half so they can't ship supplies inland. And the next thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to take an army and you're going to have to invade the South and you're going to have to defeat the Southern Army. And everybody at the time, including Lincoln, pretty much said, no, that's too complicated. We don't even have a Navy to do all that blockade stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to take our 90-day enlistments, we're going to go down, we're going to defeat the rebels, and that's going to put an end to this rebellion. As it turned out, this is pretty much exactly how the war went, and it went on for 4 years. It was not any easy task. What this red dot represents here is the first Battle of Bull Run. And the first Battle of Bull Run was when the Yankee Army was going to go down, they were going to defeat the Southern forces, and they were so sure of that all the ladies and all the gentlemen rode out in their carriages and took their picnic baskets and their Madeira, and they were going to sit and they were going to watch the rebels turn tail and run. Well, just exactly the opposite happened, and the rebel forces won the day, and the Yankees ended up fleeing back on foot, dropping their equipment, their guns, and everything else, and the gentlemen and the ladies ran back to Washington in a panic. They felt that they was afraid that they were going to end up invading Washington and taking it over, but that never did happen. If we zoom in a little bit further here, what we got is Grant started on down the Ohio River, and there were a couple fortresses. They were actually on the Tennessee River, Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. He took control of those. Of course, there was the Battle of Shiloh, 1862 in April. And then they went on down. There was island number 10. He took that, and then he went down and laid siege to Vicksburg. Now, this is the area where Chamberlain spent all of his time when he was in the war. Started out in this Pensacola area, was over in New Orleans, was up in Port Hudson. That was another big fortress on the Mississippi River, and then this is this Red River. Now, most people who have been involved in the Civil War know a little bit about it, certainly know about Vicksburg. How many people have heard of Port Hudson and the siege of Port Hudson? Now, I never did either, okay? Not until I read the book. And then we'll talk a little bit more about that. If we zoom in further here, you know, this is where he started out. This is always controlled by Union forces. This is the Santa Rosa Island. There was a tent camp there. It was called Camp Seward. And that's where he was. And it was outside of Fort Pickens. The rebel forces were in control of this whole area. Pensacola, Fort Barrancas, Fort McRae, the Navy Yard. And what happened the first time he saw combat was Union artillery bombarded this whole area. And then the rebel forces were unable to withstand their bombardment. And what they did, they fled up towards the Tennessee area. And this area fell. And this is where we talk about that letter writing. You know, this is a letter that he writes to his sister at the start of the war in 1862. I wish I knew what Congress was doing about the slavery question, or that they had the same old shilly-shally business of trying to put down this rebellion, but yet save its cause. That's American slavery. Because there was a thought at the start of the war that we'll just put down a rebellion and we'll worry about the slavery question at a later time. And Lincoln even thought that. And a lot of the northern politicians and a lot of the northern generals thought that. Slavery had been abolished in England in 1836, but in 1861 it was still going strong here. The doom of slavery is sealed, and no insane politician tried to avert his just fate, and perhaps we are to suffer some more great defeat before we wake up to the fact we are dealing with a wary and relentless foe. What he's talking about there is the first battle of Bull Run. He knew at that particular time that this was not going to be an easy task, that they were going to have, this was going to be a long, drawn-out war. A little bit of religion stuff. God on his throne sits in judgment and take notes about passing events. He talks about camp life, that where he found when he went across to Pensacola, how the rebels were living. And what he says is, the rebels lived pretty well. It looks like from what was left behind, they had good quarters, they had good stables for their horses, looked like they had good medical care, looked like that, all in all, they lived pretty well. What he does take note of, though, he's shocked by, there's a 12-13 area that was a planing mill, a sawmill, and this was totally destroyed, where boilers burst, railroad tracks torn up, buildings burnt, and he's never seen this type of destruction before, and he notes that. But he will, as the war goes on, see much more of this type of destruction. He is a farmer, so he knows about the land. He looks at the land and he says, yeah, it's very pretty and everything, but this would not be a good place to farm. And he talks about the local people too. And he says, of course, the local people were all told, when the Yankees come, there's going to be nothing but rape, pillage, and plunder. And of course, that wasn't true. And he says pretty much that the local people accepted them pretty well when they figured out that the Yankees had neither push nor arms. He also talks about the Union Army and how they were supplied, how things were for them. And what he says, they were supplied very well. They had good clothing, they had good medical care, they had good tents. And what he says is that some of the Union soldiers that came in there probably never had it so good, that they came from just poor farming communities and that they were very well supplied, very well fed by the Union Army. He also talks about the slaves that come in. They're referred to as contrabands. They have a lot of wild rumors. Richmond's been burned. Davis has escaped in a balloon. This is another letter that he writes to his mother. Once again, they're talking about slavery. And at the time of the war, is called a war between the states, brother against brother, war of northern aggression, this and that and the other thing. And one of the issues that always comes up, that this is about state sovereignty. This war is about states' rights. That's what it's about. But what he states is that it will teach us that a national crime and sin, even though backed by the whole force of government, cannot forever be continued in without bringing down upon the nation the judgments of heaven. This war is to end slavery. This is what Lincoln says later on in his second inaugural address in March of 1865, but he talks about this way before. Of course, I'm sure Lincoln thought, There's two way before, but he first publicly came out and said this when he was inaugurated. He refers to the war, when he talks about, it's nothing about states' rights or state sovereignty. This is about the slaveholders' rebellion. That's what this war is about. Okay, New Orleans Falls, you can see in your map there. And New Orleans Falls, that's when David Farragut, he's a flag officer at the time, and he runs past the forts at the mouth of the Mississippi, and the city of New Orleans is captured. Chamberlain's regiment, the 75th, he's still in the 75th at this time, and they're transferred to New Orleans. Who's in charge of New Orleans? The major general is a guy named Benjamin Butler. Benjamin Butler is a political general. Now, by a political general, he didn't have any formal military training like from West Point. He may be in charge of a few militias. He was a politician from Massachusetts, a former governor. He came for money. And I'm not criticizing Lincoln here because he had to put together a whole coalition of different kinds of people. So he certainly had to use his political generals. But there's a couple things about Butler. Butler was very draconian in how he treated the Southern people. For example, if a Southern lady walked by a Union soldier and made a remark about you're nothing but a low-life blue belly, then they would be subject to arrest and treated as a prostitute. Butler was also had a couple of nicknames. One was Beast Butler because of the way he treated the people, and the other one was Spoons, and that was because he was accused of going into the Southern mansions and stealing all the silverware. Now Butler was extremely corrupt too because never let a war get in the way of a politician making some money. So what happened is he ends up getting relieved of command. But the other thing that's important to note here is there was the Louisiana Native Guards. And the Louisiana Native Guards was a local militia, a Southern militia, that was made up of blacks and free black men and Creoles. And they were to defend New Orleans against the Union Army. But when New Orleans collapsed, that was pretty much the end of them. But what Butler says, Butler wasn't all bad. He says, well, how about you come work for us now? And they basically say, yeah, okay, we'll do that. So the Louisiana Native Guard starts out as a Southern militia and ends up being a Union force. And they are the first African-American combat troops, is what they turn into. Now, he gets relieved, they get a new major general. This new major general is Nathan Banks. Nathan Banks is another political general. He is also from Massachusetts. He comes from money. The good quality about him, he's able to recruit, he's able to get a lot of men, he's able to get a lot of support. The bad thing about him, he's not a very good general. He's not a very good tactician. Part of the reason he gets set down there is because he was a victim of Stonewall Jackson's Valley campaign in 1862. Stonewall Jackson basically ran circles around him, so he got sent down there. He reverses many of Butler's orders and policies. He's seen as much more secessionist friendly. Chamberlain actually prefers Butler, with all his faults, to Banks. But the question comes up, now we have these black troops, we have this Louisiana Native Guards, how are we going to use them? What are we going to do with them? And Lincoln decides that they're going to have a combat role. So we've been over this before. It's all about taking control of the Mississippi. The two major fortresses left on there, you take a look at your map, is Vicksburg and Port Hudson. Okay, so Vicksburg, we've all heard about Vicksburg. Vicksburg falls on July the 4th. Falls one day after Lee's defeat at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, it started on May 18th, but the siege of Port Hudson starts a few days later. Starts on May 22nd. At this particular time, Chamberlain is sick with the mumps. He gets there a little bit late. He's still in the 75th. The siege is not well conducted because who's in charge of conducting it is Nathan Banks. Nathan Banks isn't a great general. There are two major assaults during this siege. The first major assault takes place on May 22nd. And this is an assault by the Louisiana Native Guards. And it's an utter disaster and it's utter defeat. And this is the first use of black troops in combat, and they had black leaders at this particular time. Now, the second assault takes place on June the 14th, and the 75th are used as advanced skirmishers, and once again, that's another failed assault. There are many killed and wounded at this particular time. Why was it a failed assault? This is why it was a failed assault. What you had was you had massed infantry going uphill, assaulting entrenched positions, and you can see here, they're supported by artillery. Anytime you have that, no matter what it is, it's going to be a defeat for the ones that are assaulting these fortified positions. And that's exactly what happened there. This is another depiction of the Union gunboats trying to run past the batteries at Port Hudson. Now, this is what a white soldier says about the black troops. He says they charged and recharged and didn't know what retreat meant. They lost in their regiment some 400 men, as I can learn. This settled the question about them not fighting well. They, on the contrary, make splendid soldiers and are some of the finest fighting men that we have. Life for Chamberlin at this time is about to change. And how it's about to change is Banks establishes this Corps d'Afrique. And Chamberlain gets a commission as a captain as a result of that. And they're eventually reorganized into the 97th United States Colored Infantry. Why it's called d'Afrique, I'm not sure. I think it might be some of the Creole influence, you know, the French influence on the thing. And now what you have white officers in charge of black troops. There's a lot of different reasons for this, and certainly this is a controversial area. Some of the reasons for this is certainly there's prejudice and racism involved. For example, there was the thought that black troops will obey white officers better because they're used to white overseers. Some of the other reasons for it was that some of the white officers wanted to be in charge of black troops. The reason for that was a little bit self-serving, that they thought this would be a good pathway to promotion. Another reason for it was they would help the black man fight for his freedom. That was probably what Chamberlain, wanted to do. And another thing to keep in mind is some of the white officers that were in charge of black troops were better trained and better qualified than white officers in charge of white troops. Anybody have a clue as to why that was? The reason was because the upper command in the Union Army, they wanted the black troops to succeed. They did not want them to fail, So, like I said, the reasons are varied for that. Still a little bit of a controversial area, but that's part of the reason Chamberlain ended up in charge there. The other thing was Chamberlain was disgusted with the 75th at that time. He thought the 75th was nothing but a bunch of drunken rabble, led by more drunken rabble. So, the other thing would happen with some of the black officers, even though they were brave and they were good leaders, that they did not have some of the educational background in military protocol because they had been enslaved people. This especially comes true when you talk about engineering. Because in order to be an engineering officer, this was written in the book. This doesn't mean that it happened all the time. That they had to be proficient in algebra, trig, drawing. They had the ability to keep and record activity was like a natural for Chamberlain. That's what he did. They had to understand building materials as a strength and fortifications for dams. They had to know how to clear waterways. They had to know how to build dams, make roads, pontoon bridges. This clearing waterways was a big deal. The reason it was a big deal was because a lot of the tributaries to the Mississippi were shallow, and parts of the Mississippi were shallow too. So all you had to do was a gunboat had to go down, or you fell a couple of big trees, and then everything came to a screeching halt. They built fortifications. Some of the fortifications they built were parapets, bastions, traverses, and fascines. What the heck are they? Okay, a bastion is, as you can see up here, what this is designed to do is it's designed for defending forces for cross field of fire that makes it much more difficult for attacking forces. There's a couple of depictions of them. They go back certainly to the Revolution. There's fascines. They were bundles of sticks put together to reinforce fortifications. And there were parapets. And what parapets there were other fortifications. These are sticks built on top of trenches. And then what traverses were, traverses date back certainly to the Revolution, Napoleonic times. And what they were on to put on the ends of an army to prevent flanking movements. And they were used up until certainly World War I and probably even World War II too. Now, there's a couple of videos, I'm not going to show a couple of those videos, but they will be in the copies that you make, and if you want to, you can go back and look at the videos. What the videos do is they were made by the reenactor, and they talk about what Captain Chamberlin did at various times as far as his job as an engineer. Now, in 1864, he starts writing back and forth to a girl that he knew in high school that when it was in Senate at the time. Her name was Anna Bullock, and she moved out to Iowa to be with her family. But what's interesting here is when they wrote back and forth, they just didn't talk about trivial things. One of the things they talked about is equal and exact justice in the spirit of the immortal Declaration of Independence. He understood that sometimes the Declaration wasn't always lived up to. You know, and they talked about that. The whole nation is guilty of the crime and the curse of American slavery. The curse of American slavery. There was an author, his name was William Faulkner. He grew up in the South. His ancestors fought for the South in the Civil War. They owned slavery. He wrote a couple of books. He wrote a lot of books, but two of the books he wrote were Absalom, Absalom, and The Sound and the Fury. And throughout those books, what he talks about is the curse that slavery left on the entire Southern culture that went on well beyond the war, that went into decades, into the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and even beyond. Now, the interesting thing about that, in one of Chris Bukowski's Emerging Civil War, he talks about the same thing and brings it up with William Faulkner and brings up that thing about, you know, the curse of American slavery. A nation that boasts of freedom, but there are 3 million people in hopeless servitude, and they both talk about the temperance unit movement. She was a member of the temperance unit back in Senate. Okay, this Red River campaign, we talked about a little bit before. Probably nobody's heard of that, right? Well, I never did either until I, read this a little bit. What the Red River campaign was, there was a Union general. His name was Henry Halleck. He was a superior to General Grant. Halleck and Grant didn't get along. The reason they didn't get along is because every time Grant would want to do something, Halleck would say no. When Grant did it, and it was a success, what Halleck would do was tell Lincoln that was a great idea, it was mine. Okay? So that's the reason they didn't get along. Halleck thought that this would be a good idea, and the attempt here was to split the South in half again. Who he got to carry this out was Nathan Banks. Now, Nathan Banks, he has ideas here of political aspirations well after the war, probably running for president. But this campaign is a disaster from the start. The reason it's a disaster is because of the weather, because Banks is a poor tactician. They're under constant fire from the rebel forces, numerous ambushes. They have a very high rate of casualties as they're going along. Their soldiers falling out and dying along the way. What the Chamberlain's regiment did, they were involved in repairing bridges, roads destroyed by the rebels, and they retreated back down through Alexandria. Chamberlain in his book, when he talks about somehow Alexandria caught on fire, the truth of the matter is Yankees burned it to the ground. That's what they did. There's a little map of it right there, and what you can see is you can see the Union forces going up, and it's two Confederate generals, one's Kirby Smith, the other one's Richard Taylor, who didn't really get along either, but they ended up sending the Union forces packing down through Alexandria. Just a disaster for the Union Army. Okay, now through all this time, coming up to 1864 now, he's involved in this war. He's fighting, the rebels, but he develops this empathy for the South. And what he says is, he talks about now, instead of looks like the rebels live pretty well, he talks about and he's shocked by the utter devastation to the homes, the plantations, and the countryside. He's never seen anything like it. And what's a little bit important to keep in mind here, the Civil War was not a war on a civilian population. There was atrocities that certainly were committed, especially in Kansas, Missouri, Lawrence, Kansas, the Jayhawkers and Quantrell and his raiders and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, it was not a war on the civilian population. But now what he talks about, when you come across rebels and they take a prisoner, they're poor condition. Their clothing, their equipment, their health, they have no shoes. They're a mess. They're terrible. But he has a little bit of, kind of admiration, a grudging admiration. He says they fight through sheer desperation, but they fight very well. They're the most poorly clad men you could ever talk about. But this is the same thing that Harriet Beecher Stowe talked about in her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But at the same time, he has this empathy. The Union Army, and he had strict orders against foraging. They weren't supposed to live off the land. They had plenty of equipment, plenty of supply. But in this particular passage right here, he talks about, we caught quite a number of sheep, pigs, and poultry on a march. And he says, I have no problem at all taking what I need from the rebels if I can use it for my men. So he seems like he has a sympathy, but on the other hand, hey, I got to do what I have to do for my men, you know. Now, here's a passage here that I think is pretty profound. And he taught black soldiers how to read and write, and he wrote letters home for black soldiers. But what he says is, the influence of the schoolroom has more to do with the molding of character of a nation than all other influences combined. The influence of home is considered stronger than all others, but the bulk work of our free institutions is the proper education of children. Any comments? What do you think? You think that still rings true today? 170 years later? Think it withstood the test of time a little bit? Yeah, I'd say so. I think that's a little bit profound, you know? Okay. The selection of 1864, it's nothing more than a footnote in American history. It's not in the history books. Nobody talks about it. But at the particular time, it was a big deal. First thing we have to talk a little bit about here, what's going on in the war. The war is actually going pretty good for the Union. Atlanta has fallen, and Sherman has done this without a lot of casualties to the Union forces. He's done good, you know. What's going on in the East is Grant, starting with the Battle of Wilderness, is gone one battle after another, one Union victory after another. But the results is there's been a lot of Union casualties. And there was another battle called Cold Harbor, which Grant tried assaulting fortified positions with infantry. And it was a disaster. There was a lot of Union casualties. Grant develops the nickname the Butcher. So what's happening is going on at the time, yeah, the Union's winning, things are going along fine, but there's a lot of dead Union soldiers. The North is getting tired of the war. You know? So, the Democratic platform at that time, if you go back and read it, what they talk about is state sovereignty, sovereignty of the states. And it's peace at any cost. Peace at any cost, what he talks about, and this is he's understanding big issues, would have left blacks in submission. And that was not a good thing. And this is what he says about McClellan. Now, a couple of things about McClellan is important to remember. McClellan was hired by Lincoln twice. McClellan was fired by Lincoln twice. He had some good qualities. He was a good organizer. He was fairly good at keeping his men supplied, keeping them well trained. He was even at times well liked by his troops, but he wouldn't use his army. He constantly overestimated the size of the rebel forces. There's at the Battle of Antietam, the famous Lost Orders 191, where he has Lee's orders right in front of him. He knows what Lee is going to do. And the best he can do when he outnumbers Lee 2 or 3 to 1 is fight Lee to a draw. So that's the background of this a little bit. And McClellan himself said that, you know, he would continue to prosecute the war because he would do it his way because he was smarter than everybody else. But at the same time, that was not the Democratic platform. Okay? So this is what he says about McClellan. Imagine a major general in the Army of the Union accepted a nomination for presidency from the foulest, most infernal conclave of traitors. That's what he thought about him. I'm not saying he's absolutely right, but that's what his opinion was. He says the Rebs will say hurrah for McClellan. And this is paraphrased a little bit, but to the heart of what he says. The election of Lincoln will be worth more than any battlefield victory. Now, as it turned out, Lincoln won by a landslide. But at the time, nobody knew that was going to happen. So this was a pretty big deal at that time. He understood what the issues were. Now, the issue comes up of black pay for black soldiers. White soldiers got $13 a month with nothing deducted for clothing. Black soldiers got $10 a month with $3 deducted for clothing. Of course, that wasn't right. Eventually, Congress made this right, turned it around. They got their back pay and stuff. But this was a big bone of contention between Frederick Douglass and between Lincoln. Because what you had Douglass saying was Douglass says, hey, they fight the fight, pay them the money. Of course, he's right. And you got Lincoln saying, wait a minute, you got to be patient. I got some political realities here. Of course, Lincoln has his point too. Okay, now if you look at your map there, what you see is that Fort Hudson has fallen. There's only one port left, and that's Mobile Bay. This is what Grant wanted them to do instead of chasing their tail, instead of going on the Red River campaign. He says, we have to take this port. David Farragut at this time is an admiral. He runs past Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan, Mobile Bay Falls, and this is where you get the famous line, damn the torpedoes full speed ahead. The two forts are Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan. That's Fort Gaines it was in 1865, and that is it's a tourist location now. My wife and I have been there, So, this is another campaign. I want to talk a little bit about this. And this is another campaign in 1864, and it's north of Pensacola area. And what the Union forces are going to do is they're going to go in and they're going to tear up some of our railroad, create havoc for Southern infrastructure. So their support of cavalry forces, repairing bridges and roads along the way. They engage combat with the Rebs, and they get kind of a backhand comment from Confederate general who says the Negroes fought well, obstinately, and pressed us back steadily. Now, this is another video here which you really have to look at later. But what I want to talk about is in this video, what he does is he does a quote. And the quote that he makes is, this is a midnight fight that is taking place. And what he says is, the midnight fight in the Pine Woods was the most thrilling and beautiful thing I ever saw. Men are dying. Men are getting killed. He's been to war for 4 years. And he says this is beautiful, this is exciting, and this is thrilling. What do you think? Any comments? There's a little bit of desensitization to war and killing. Think that's what it could be a little bit? Oh yeah, absolutely, no doubt about it. You think there's short-term effects, a coping mechanism? Yeah, absolutely, But there may be some bad long-term effects, right? From this type of thinking. Okay, so at this particular point, the war's starting to wind down. There's no doubt about it who's going to win. He becomes stationed at Fort Barrancas. He's involved in the repair of some of these other forts along the way. Camp life is good. It's relatively calm. He spends his time reading, and he reads Shakespeare, and he reads de Tocqueville, and he reads John Milton, and stuff like that. He just doesn't read what's coming out of the local paper or anything like that. That's Fort Barrancas, a depiction of it in Pensacola Bay. And the next thing that comes along is the assassination of Lincoln. Okay? And what happens then is when this happens, of course, there's a lot of rumors that fly around. You can imagine, that there must have been like. At first, when he hears about the assassination, he becomes enraged. And he says this war should not be a war of revenge and a war of extermination. He later writes, seems to calm down a little bit, and says that we have to work together, and what we have to do is bind up the nation's wounds. What's important to remember about the assassination of Lincoln, it's not just the assassination of Lincoln. What this is an attempt to overthrow the United States government. And these are all the conspirators. Of course, Wilkes is dead, and I believe all of these received prison sentences, but these 4 with a red dot end up being hung. Now, Payne, that wasn't his last name was Powell, and what he did was he stabbed one of the Home Secretary of State Seward, who was already sick. He stabbed him, it's a wonder he didn't kill him. Azerot here, being the wingnut that he was supposed to assassinate Johnson, but he went out and got drunk. So the assassination happened in April. In July, these 4 were hung. That's like 4 months later. I don't think we could do that today either, you know? Okay. Now, after the war, he still remains in the service, and he becomes the Provost Marshal of Connex County. That's where it is. And at this particular time, he says occasionally we're well received by the Southern people, but for the most part, no. All their men are dead. All their properties burned or destroyed. They're bitter. They lost the war. They're not going to be well received. Not well received at all. By Provost Marshal, what it is, he's like in charge of civil matters, he's in charge of criminal matters, he's in charge of swearing oaths to the Union, he's like the chief cook and bottle washer. But now he's starting to become disgruntled. He's starting to become disgruntled with the way that the blacks, the freedmen, are being treated. And he becomes very critical of President Johnson's policies. He understands what Johnson's doing or not doing. For example, there's a Civil Rights Act of 1865 which passed, then comes along the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Johnson vetoes this, but the veto is overturned by Congress and is passed. There's Freedmen's Bureau's bills. Johnson also vetoes these, and once again, Congress overruns the vetoes, overrules the vetoes. But when he still passes, what he does, he weakens those things every chance he gets. For example, if a Southern white complains about how they were treated, then what he does, he replaces them with somebody that is more friendly to the Southern white population. There are 3 amendments that are passed after the Civil War, 13th, 14th, and 15th. 13th has to do with the abolition of slavery, 15th has to do with voting rights, and the 14th Amendment, there are college courses taught on it, and we're still arguing over today. But what it does, it makes the first 10 amendments applicable to the states. And it has the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. And Johnson is also against the 14th Amendment. Now, the reason Johnson gives his arguments goes back to the states' rights, states' sovereignty, that the federal government is exceeding its lawful power and authority. That's the reasoning that he uses behind it. We're still talking about these issues today, federal rights and states' rights. Okay, he proposes, he marries to Anna. There's conflicting accounts of his health. Some of it the author did not share with me. He fathers 5 children with Anna. He moves in with his brother, George and Elbridge, and his health declines, and he hangs himself in his barn November 9th of 1880. When I looked up at the census, the last census on him is June of 1880, and what it says at that time is that he has disease of the liver. Of course, you think cirrhosis being caused from drinking, but I believe also I've been told that malaria, the after effects of that, can cause issues with the liver too. So, I think a couple of things to keep in mind here, okay? The Union won. It was a great victory, but he's a junior level officer. He's been around through a lot of poor leadership. Banks, especially Banks, poor tactician, that Red River campaign, which was a disaster, the assaults on Port Hudson, terrible slaughter with no results. He talks about at one time our loss was mostly 200 dead and 1,000 wounded. That's a lot of dead guys, much less 1,000 wounded, and a lot of crying wounded, He writes, I never felt so lonely before. And remember, he's an idealist, he's a devout Christian. He was also involved in something called the Second Battle of Sabine Pass. And what that was Union gunboats who tried to run past some Confederate batteries. They got stuck on sandbars, and they were just annihilated. There was probably 300 Union soldiers taken prisoner, probably 60 killed, a lot more wounded. There was 0 Confederate casualties. So he was involved in that too and saw that also. So he has bouts of serious depression, and he has other health issues too. But what I want to spend a minute here talking about, I want to talk about his wife, Anna Bullock. Because I think sometimes we have the tendency to forget what women have done and their involvement in wars that have gone by and their roles. What's important to remember here is she supports him during the war with letters, constantly. You know, she's 40 years old when he dies. She's left with 5 children, ages 3 to 13. 2 of those are twins that are 3 years old. The grief, the social stigma, the hardship going through, especially, remember, she's not part of the Chamberlin family. She's the Bullock family. She's an in-law, right? There had to be a lot of issues there. What she does is she still has access to his pension. She purchases a farm back in Blair, Nebraska. And it's a sod house that she builds, her brother builds for her, which isn't unusual because there wasn't any lumber. But eventually, she did get a wood structured house. But through this all, she retains his letters, his writings, his photographs, his artifacts, his uniform, and his musket. And I think this is a little bit tribute to her. Plus, she raises those 5 kids and does a pretty good job of raising them. But she herself only lives 12 more years and dies at age 51. Now, one of her children, I think there's a little bit of credit to her, it was Mabel Chamberlin. She was 3 years old at the time, and she raised her completely. She ended up becoming salutatorian of her class, or valedictorian of her class, and she was asked to address the class at graduation. And what she addressed it for was leaving tracts. And what she says, how do we succeed in leaving honorable and successful tracts? Her answers are, be a Christian, form good habits from the start of the world for ourselves, do not abandon the goal until it is achieved, and have some aim in life. I think that's a credit to Mom here too, because Mom is basically the one that raised her, you know. There's the house that he moved back into up on Chamberlin Road. That's a very, very big farmhouse. Could hold easily 2 or 3 families. My aunt tutored me in that house in the 6th and the 8th grade. There's no longer any Chamberlins living on Chamberlin Road. That's the barn out back. I have no idea if that's the barn where he hung himself. I'm sure that's been rebuilt a few times. There's his uniform. As I said before, this is a pretty close copy. And there's the author when he was much younger with his musket. There's a flag for the 95th and 97th. And that's the reenactor that helped me out. Okay? He was a pretty good guy, very knowledgeable person. There's some of his reenactors, and there's quite a crew of Yankees, huh? You know. He had a couple of descendants too. One was involved in the invasion of D-Day. He was with the 508. If you've seen the movie Band of Brothers, that's about the 506. John was 21 years old when he was killed. He was killed on June the 9th. He won a Silver Star. And his much younger brother was Richard Dick Chamberlin. He was in Vietnam. He was in the Navy. He was 3 tours in Vietnam. He won a Bronze Star. He was a combat medic. He was also in the Peace Corps. He was in Malaysia. And then he ended up committing suicide up in Watertown in 1994. So these are the people that helped me out. And, I thank them very much. But talking about the bigger picture stuff, okay? And this is what I want to leave you with, is that I've been fortunate enough to be able to come in here and talk about one of my ancestors, okay? I appreciate that very much. But you also have ancestors that helped build America. And it's important that you pass this stuff on to your kids and your grandkids. And it's important that they know that America did not start with Facebook and the internet. So whether or not you know it or not, they don't have to be military people. They can be people that worked on the railroad. They can be people that worked in factories. They could have been farmers like John was and his family was, or whatever. They helped build America. And do not forget about the women and what the women did and their supporting role. Their community efforts, belonging to church groups, all the things that women did back then. But it was so, so important to how America was built. So with that, up here also is the website for John Blanchett. you can take that and go to his Facebook page. He's always got stuff in there on Chamberlin and on the 97. So with that, I thank you very much. Is there any questions? Yes, sir.
My great-great-grandfather served in the Civil War. He was from Central New York, Peterborough, near Morrisville. But he was in the cavalry, and he was in a unit out of Rochester.
Okay.
And my question always was, why would he be so far away to get into a unit, or was that just the closest one available?
I would know that. Maybe, yes. Maybe that's where it was the closest one.
Yeah.
Could be. Very well could be, yes. You know? Yeah. I mean, it's pretty understandable why he enlisted in Auburn, living in Senate. You know, it's right around the corner, you know? But, yeah, Pewter County, you know.
And when he got wounded, he was listed as missing in action. And then when he got out of the hospital and went back into service, they said, whoops, he's back again. I mean, it's just quite a story.
Tough life, huh? Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Any other questions or anything? Okay, thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you again, Richard. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Just a quick little PSA of upcoming events. Tomorrow night, we're having a concert here. Bart Dentino will be playing. He does a really nice acoustic show. If you haven't heard him yet, please do. And then next week, we have a double feature. On Thursday, we have Java with Joe in the morning at 9 o'clock. We have had a change in programming. So Frank Clement will not be here to talk about bricks. He had an emergency that will take him away. So I'll be filling in and doing a presentation called Joseph Ellicott's Ghost, the Lasting Impact of the Holland Land Company. So hopefully you'll come for that. And then in the evening at 7 p.m. we have Ben Kemp from Grant's Cottage talking about Grant and Twain. And then there's still time to get tickets for a murder mystery, which will be at Batavia Country Club on Saturday, May 2nd. You can go to the website for tickets or reach out to me and I'll take care of it for you. So hopefully we'll see you at the rest of the stuff for April and beginning of May. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.